The next numbered entry in the mainline Shin Megami Tensei series is releasing at the end of this week, and being a channel that was discovered by many due to its Mega 10 videos, I've had a lot of people asking me about it over the last year. People have been asking if I'm going to cover it on the channel, how I think the game looks, and so on. I've been wanting to talk about my thoughts on SMT5 for a while, but kept putting it off and waiting for a decent gap in pre-release materials to settle my thoughts a little bit. But to my surprise, that gap never really came. This is one thing I actually want to give Atlus credit for. The game's initial reveal was probably way too early, and most likely done to help Nintendo sell people on the Switch, no doubt about that. But ever since the first story trailer we got back in July 2020, it's been a pretty steady buildup of new trailers, gameplay showcases, new art, and such. Considering a lot of former tentpole titles from Atlus have been subject to drip-fed marketing campaigns full of obnoxious countdown timers and self-indulgent livestream events that take way too long and reveal way too little, I'm pretty happy with how they've been showcasing this game compared to other titles. So, there's a good amount of pre-release material out there, but to be honest, I haven't really been following this game as close as I'm sure a lot of you have been. I watched the major trailers when they dropped and watched the Nintendo Treehouse coverage, but aside from that, I haven't really been going out of my way to look things up about the game or really keep up to date. So if there's anything you wanted to hear me discuss in this video and I don't end up talking about it, it's probably why. I'm just still in the dark about some things. I say this all because sometimes I think people get the impression, especially those who find my Megami Tensei stuff and then start following me from there, think that I'm actually a bigger fan of the games that I actually am, or at least the more modern entries in the series. To be perfectly transparent with all of you, I'm not really going into SMT5 with the common attitude I see from a lot of Mega 10 fans, which is, holy shit, I can't wait to play the next mainline entry. My current thoughts are more along the lines of, it looks cool, I hope it wins me back. Did I just use SMT5 to clickbait people into watching a video where I complain about my problems with modern Atlus? You're goddamn right I did. So yeah, I haven't really been feeling a lot of the recent Mega 10 titles. I used to be a person who would say caveats before talking about this, like, oh, I could never say that these games are actually bad, they're just a little disappointing, or something like that. But with more time and distance away from them, I actually think they're just kinda bad. If there's one thing I can thank Shin Megami Tensei IV Apocalypse and Persona 5 for, it's for making me realize I don't really care about how incredibly balanced and fine-tuned an RPG's gameplay is if the writing is complete dog shit. And really, Shin Megami Tensei IV Apocalypse is where a lot of my frustration with modern Mega 10 titles really started. I had a great time with this game for most of its length, but after wrapping it up it felt pretty hollow and somehow lesser than the sum of its parts. I love this game's music, the gameplay and balancing are dramatic improvements from SMT4. It took a more interesting, character-centric approach to its storytelling, which was kind of unique at the time, and it made an attempt to break away from the stagnant alignment system that the series needs to either reinvent or move beyond at this point if it wants to grow. Unfortunately, Atlus decided to take all these exciting narrative possibilities and use them to tell a story that is painfully standard by RPG standards, and instead of shaking up that typical law versus chaos dichotomy with a new set of antagonists with interesting things to add to the story, it essentially boiled down to two different branches. Are you normal or are you the Joker? SMT4 Vanilla felt like a celebration of the series up to that point. I personally view it as Mega 10's equivalent to Final Fantasy IX in that regard. It's littered with callbacks and allusions to prior entries. The game was also made during a time when Atlus's parent company Index was in some deep financial shit, and it was likely clear to the people on the inside that the future of Atlus was on rocky ground. This might have been their swan song if things didn't go well. It's always felt like a culmination of the series' best elements thus far, which is why I expected SMT4 Apocalypse to go from that point and build upon it, iterate to some degree. I don't really think it did, it just kind of built something next to it rather than build upon it. From the moment the game's protagonist was revealed, it was clear SMT4A would be following in the footsteps of Nocturne specifically, and true to form, the game attempted to once again reframe the traditional law versus chaos alignment conflict as a false war built upon a system of oppression, with Yahweh in power. When Nocturne did the same reveal, it came at the end of a long and difficult optional path that had the player descend through a hellish dimension, taking on brutal challenges and gaining new story scenes that fundamentally recontextualize the main plot. The true demon ending of Nocturne is by far the hardest story route for the player to take, but the game rewards players for taking on this struggle. The player has much to gain by going through the Labyrinth of Amala, not just in terms of additional experience, but also by looting its treasures and gaining new powerful demons from its chambers as well. Narratively, the player is strung along by Lucifer, who provides additional details about the setting of Nocturne, which is sometimes alluded to, but otherwise not found in the core story of the game. Considering Lucifer is the one giving all this info and he's ultimately doing it so that he can gain another ally in his war against the heavens, the reliability or accuracy of his lectures might be suspect, but I think this ambiguity is a real strength and it overall adds a lot to the narrative. Even the game's 3 primary alignments feel specially crafted to help deliver this message. They're deeply flawed individuals, each and every one of the reason holders, and the worlds they wish to create aren't likely to entice the average player into supporting one of them versus taking the neutral or true demon routes. But I think it's important that Nocturne specifically chose to not refer to the Law Neutral Chaos alignment axis by name, despite clearly having a lot to say about it. The 3 reasons can be easily mapped to each of these alignments, but the game takes the time to blur the lines as much as it can. Hikawa's reason could bring about a world that many would find identical to the Law alignment from previous games, but he's introduced as a powerful figure in the Cult of Gaia, a typical Chaos faction, and he summons Baphomet the first time the Demi-Fiend meets him. Chiaki supports a reason of brutal Darwinism that many would associate with the Chaos alignment, but she starts the game disgusted by the occult and later on works with the Archangels. Isamu's worldview is the closest thing we have to neutrality among the 3 reasons, but it takes an apathetic, isolationist stance to an alignment that is nominally about balance and idealized coexistence with other beings. These blurring of the boundaries between the traditional mainline alignments are there for a purpose. It reinforces Lucifer's revelation that these battles are in service to a greater cosmological status quo, and reframes the battles that took place in earlier entries as part of a grander cycle of abhorrent death and rebirth. At the same time, the characters are written well, and it's easy to see how a snobby rich high schooler like Chiaki or a lazy coward like Isamu develop their philosophies on life, and more importantly, the greater implications that they have for the worlds that they want to create. Shin Megami Tensei IV Apocalypse takes a very different approach to telling this same type of story. It's like it wanted to do what Nocturne did, but nobody involved really took the time to carefully consider what these individual story elements were doing and what made them effective. Instead, SMT4A posits that anyone who chooses Law or Chaos is a stinky doo-doo brain, going as far as relegating the Law and Chaos endings to obviously bad endings. Considering most people who played SMT4 Vanilla weren't super happy with how the Law or Chaos routes were handled and how obviously lacking they are compared to the neutral ending, it kinda felt like a kick to the shins. Instead of blurring the lines between these alignments to show that their long-term consequences lead to a similar endpoint, SMT4A chose to reveal that the leader of SMT4's Chaos and Law factions were actually 2 halves of Satan, the right hand of Yahweh. As much as I love Satan's redesign for this game, I think everything about his inclusion is remarkably stupid. Nocturne's message wasn't trying to convey that Law and Chaos were basically the same thing, but that the traditional conflict between the alignments as depicted in the games up to that point is restrictive by its very nature, and self-perpetuating. These ideologies are not identical and aren't supposed to be seen as such. Their flaws just happen to both lead to ruinous societies, and their ever-present nature erases the possibility of humanity ever finding its own path or creating different ideologies. One could argue that neutrality is supposed to be that new path, but both the earliest and latest entries in the mainline series make it clear that neutrality isn't really an end goal, it's kind of a temporary stopgap that doesn't actually solve anything on a long enough timeline. Nocturne's bad ending, often referred to as the demon ending or regular demon ending, even went out of its way to criticize this mode of thinking. Players who went out of their way to play the Demi-Fiend as a cowardly centrist who neither supports a reason nor has the inner strength to restore the human world are locked out of the final dungeon, and the game essentially chastises you for refusing to grapple with its depicted ideologies or really believe in anything. In contrast, Nocturne's true demon ending is as triumphant as it is ominous. It is clear that the multiverse itself is about to see a grand shift in paradigms, but whether or not this cosmic revolution will be to the benefit of humanity is left ambiguous in a way I truly love. The player has chosen a path of hardship and has committed to taking a massive risk that could lead to liberation and prosperity or irrevocable destruction, or maybe both. If I had to sum up the difference between these 2 games, it's that Nocturne fosters a deeper understanding of these philosophies and bids the player to reject them for what they are, whereas SMT4 Apocalypse asks the player to refuse to engage with the conflict at all, and solve the problem through the power of friendship and human understanding. My problem with this isn't just the fact that it's an RPG cliché that way too many games rely on, it's that this framing is a gross oversimplification of the real-world issues that alignments are supposed to represent. I commend the game for taking a revolutionary stance and being unapologetic in the way it asks the player to disrupt the status quo of subjugation, but this story is told in a way that reduces these core messages to their most shallow aesthetics and manages to, at the end of the day, say little of substance in spite of its long playtime. Honestly, I think it's been a mistake for any SMT game after Nocturne to even return to the law-neutral chaos setup. Strange Journey and SMT4 both kind of botched it in my opinion, and I think Redux and Apocalypse only made things worse for both of them. I think the Devil Survivor games did a pretty good job of providing fresh takes on the traditional alignment system, but even those games only managed to make them work because they were willing to experiment a bit and move out of the rigid structure that the mainline games seemed to be reluctant to move on from for some reason. If Atlus wanted to tell a more traditional RPG story with SMT4 Apocalypse while still incorporating the alignments in a narrative capacity, I think they should have taken a look at Digital Devil Saga of all things. Of the PS2 Megami Tensei titles, DDS 1 and 2 are structurally the most similar to the other mainstream JRPGs released at the time. Law and Chaos aren't at the forefront of the game's narrative. They aren't even referenced by name if I'm remembering correctly. Rather, certain antagonists hold ideologies that have shades of Law and Chaos as part of them. The second Raito game includes a more overt alignment system, but instead of being a choice with greater implications for the world, it's mostly centered around the protagonist and his personal outlook on life. I think it's a huge mistake that Megami Tensei didn't continue down this path that was happening during the PS2 era. It feels like we've regressed since that time in terms of storytelling. I find it truly ironic that Atlus made a game like Nocturne about the rigidity of the alignment system and how it plunges everything into stagnation, only for later entries to fall into the exact same trap that they warned about. Similarly, I didn't care much for Persona 5 either. Like Shin Megami Tensei IV Apocalypse, I was having a real good time with it, up to a certain point. Again, I like the soundtrack and the gameplay a great deal. I would even go as far as to say from a gameplay perspective, Persona 5 is possibly the most mechanically sound game Atlus has ever designed. The art direction and presentation were phenomenal as well, and it's easy to see why the game caught so many people's attention. But at the end of the day, I think the game is more style than substance, and I know I'm not the first critic to make that claim. My main disappointment with Persona 5 is that after the long gap between Persona 4 and its release, I had expected a game that innovated. Instead, I felt like I got a game that incremented. As masterfully made as P5 can feel in its greatest moments, it's also a game that I find painfully unimaginative. The main cast in particular feel like they were made in a factory, stitched together using recycled elements from P3 and P4 characters. I actually think the cast just kinda sucks. Sorry. The game's initial story arc takes a bit to get going, but once it does, I thought it was downright incredible. The first palace sets the stage for a powerful story about the ways in which people feel trapped by their place in society and the abuses of those in power, and how people can come together to find liberation and hold those in power accountable for their misdeeds. Then the rest of the game happened. Modern Persona games each revolve around a unique central theme as well as a shared theme of growing into adulthood and finding one's place in the world. Persona 3 was about the nature of life and the answers we find for ourselves as to why it's worth experiencing. Persona 4 was about self-acceptance and how to move forward when faced with the tempting lies and uncomfortable truths that reality will throw at you. When the build-up to Persona 5 promised a game that was about the ways in which society makes people feel stuck in misery and tread upon by the individuals in control, I was fucking pumped. But when I actually played the game, it felt like it was trying not to trip over itself with its themes, or like the writers were just saying shit but didn't actually believe in what they were saying. I know this point's been discussed to death already online, but I think it's still the greatest example of this hypocrisy, and it's how the game treats Ann. The game goes out of its way to show the evil of sexual assault and the ways in which it harms its survivors, but later on in the game when the party members sexualize Ann in ways that she's clearly not comfortable with, the game treats it like it's lighthearted fun and just a comedic thing happening. The game can't even commit to making Shido a shitty politician that's emblematic of the ways in which modern governments fail their people, or how they're complicit in the issues of society. He has to be part of a super-duper secret group of evil people trying to overthrow the actual government. Even when it's trying to make social commentary, the game feels like it's pulling its punches or going out of its way to not step on too many toes. I've often heard people say that it feels like Persona 5 drew a little inspiration from the mainline games and that's why they like it, but I don't really agree, or at the very least I don't think it learned the right lessons. Mainline SMT games are all about bringing radical change to worlds that are controlled by flawed systems of power, but as soon as Atlus has to map these sorts of issues to a contemporary setting with institutions that hit a little closer to home than the ones found in the grand apocalyptic worlds that they have in their other games, it feels like they can't ever bring themselves to fully commit, and I think that sucks. It's kinda cowardly in my opinion. This is something that I think the series as a whole has really lost, and I miss it a ton. Even as early as the second Megami Tensei game, the final dungeon was a huge corporation that you broke into to beat up Satan, who was depicted as a crappy boss to his workers. SMT1's initial story arc even mapped out the alignments as belonging to real-life organizations. Chaos is represented by a reactionary, nationalistic Japanese military, while the Law faction is a stand-in for Western imperialism and its interventionist policies. Their leaders are even based on real historical figures. And yes, Goto is yet another government figure who is in charge of a super-duper evil group attempting a coup of the Japanese government, but at least in SMT1 it feels like an actual critique of Japanese militarism at the time, and not like the writers were trying to make a fictional entity to serve as a punching bag, so that the player got mad at them instead of the actual government. And so I think I've made my case by now, but Atlus has really frustrated me the past few years with how they've handled their titles. Like, I think the last game from them I really unironically enjoyed all the way through was Tokyo Mirage Sessions. I know its gameplay did kind of let me down in some areas and in a few places, but overall I found it was a really solid game with a unique and positive and fun story that kind of felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the rehashes of the same central ideas we've otherwise been getting, and in my opinion those rehashes haven't been done as well as previous entries in the series up to this point. So now that you've heard me read about 3,000 words summarizing my opinions on the latest Megami Tensei titles, let's talk about Shin Megami Tensei V, finally. I think it looks pretty good, all things considered. I'm really happy with the more cinematic direction this game has taken now that it isn't stuck on the 3DS. The demon designs get a chance to shine like they never have before, and they're really leaning into the differences in scale between the various creatures you encounter. I think it's a long overdue thing. What we've heard of the OST so far is fucking exceptional. Ryota Kozaka's soundtracks for 4 and 4 Apocalypse were great, and if what we've heard from SMT5's OST is indicative of the full thing, I'm sure it's going to blow me away. The UI design takes a lot of cues from Tokyo Mirage Sessions as well as SMT4, and while I know a lot of people wish it was maybe a bit more stylized, I personally think it looks great. If it ain't broke, don't fix it after all. The focus that's been given to the Nahabino's movement and the emphasis on landscape traversal has really interested me. I don't typically associate Megami Tensei as a series with engaging exploration, but I'm happy that this is something they chose to dedicate time to. So much of the Shin Megami Tensei experience comes from the setting and its unparalleled sense of atmosphere. To see these environments brought further to life and made more dynamic is very exciting to me. I'm sure people want me to talk about what I think of the battle system, but I don't know how much I really have to say because I'm sure it'll be just as exceptionally made as Atlus's other recent games. It's the part I'm frankly the least worried about. I know that special skills with unique activation conditions are a bigger part of the battle system this time around, and I assume some of the flashier attack animations we've seen in the trailers so far are tied to those special abilities. I just hope that they don't become too repetitive to watch or are easy enough to skip, at the very least. The pace of an SMT battle is very important to me, and the series has done a great job of not bogging it down with long-winded animations. I really hope that they don't drop the ball here. Like in SMT4A, Hama and Muto are no longer instant kills like they were in previous entries. In SMT4A, the instant death condition only came into play if the user was smirking. In SMT5, an instant kill chance is only possible if the target is specifically weak to either light or dark. I understand why the series is moving in this direction, and a lot of people really don't like getting hit by instant death attacks, trust me, I get it, but I personally like the tension that comes with their inclusion. It keeps me on my toes in a way that I find fun. I still think that Digital Devil Saga handled this the best. In those games, light-based attacks dealt percentage-based damage that depended on the target's current HP, while dark-based attacks were still kept as instant death spells. This was a happy compromise for me, where the risk of instant death was still present but relatively rare compared to other games, and the light-based spells still felt as though they were unique compared to the typical fire, ice, force, and electricity spells. It seems that buffs and debuffs have been depowered a little bit as well, bringing them closer to how they work in the Persona games. While they still stack, they only last a limited number of turns, and they're now split between single-target and multi-target variants, apparently. Considering how important these spells are to the flow of the boss battles in previous entries, I'm curious to see what the greater implications of these changes are going to be. I trust their judgment, but my knee-jerk reaction is that I kinda wish they kept it the same as they worked in 4 and 4A. I hope they prove me wrong though, and I'm open to that. As for the story, I was hooked by the initial pitch of the first story trailer. The idea that God has already been killed and Lucifer is in position to forge a new world he desires is a fun direction for the series to explore, and I'm really hoping it's an indication that we aren't going to just do the same old law-neutral chaos thing again, or at the very least, if we do go down that route, it'll be more interesting than what 4 and 4A did. I'm really happy that the protagonist is another case of a regular kid forging a dark pact with a supernatural entity for greater power. I know this is the third time the mainline series has done this, but I love nothing more than a well-done Faustian pact in fiction, personally. It helps that Nahobino's design is sick as hell. I think it's tied with Demi-Fiend for my favorite mainline protagonist design. I was really looking forward to see what the writers did with Dagda and Nanashi's relationship in 4A, but felt a little let down by the decisions they made. SMT is a series about friends drifting apart and eventually killing one another. I thought it would be cool to see that explored from a different angle, one in which the demonic patron who you've depended on for your powers no longer sees eye to eye with you. While this did end up happening in 4A, I think the fact that they resolved this conflict by just having his mom make a new Dagda was really silly and anticlimactic, and I was just kind of disappointed overall. I thought it was kind of lame. I don't know what SMT5 plans to do with Aogami, but I hope the relationship he shares with the protagonist gets the exploration it probably deserves, and they do some interesting things with the fact that they depend on one another to become the Nahobino. This was a major missed opportunity for Apocalypse for me, and I hope SMT5 rights this wrong by doing something cool with it. So, overall, I think the game looks really impressive from what we've seen so far, but I'm also saying this as someone who was also impressed by the pre-release build-up to 4 Apocalypse and Persona 5, and both those games ended up frustrating me greatly. I hope I'm not setting myself up for disappointment a third time now, but I'm ready to be one back if they manage to pull through and make a game I can unconditionally enjoy again. It could also be the case that Atlus just doesn't make the types of stories that agree with my specific sense of taste or narrative sensibilities anymore, and, you know, that's okay. It's not like the old Mega 10 games I enjoy are ever going away, and there are plenty of other things I love that cover those particular preferences of mine that SMT probably never really will. I'm more than happy to accept the fact that the series has changed from what it was when I first was drawn to it, and it's gone in a direction that just maybe doesn't gel with me anymore. But, like I said, I'd be happy to be proven wrong. I have the premium edition pre-ordered, mostly because I really wanted that bag. I've needed one around that size for a while now for traveling, and, you know, it looks kinda nice. Speaking of traveling, I'm supposed to be going on a road trip the weekend the game came out, but due to a winter storm that may or may not happen across the Midwest this weekend, I may be stuck at home. So I was kind of expecting to be late to the party on this game, but what I wasn't expecting was to, gain access to the game while in the middle of typing the script. I'm going to jump right in after this video is edited and just start playing right away. Depending on what my schedule looks like the rest of the week, I might try to post a first impression videos on release day, or maybe a few days later, depending on if I go on that road trip or not. I'll see you then. Have a good one.